This talk is about culture, cultural transmission, cultural evolution, and gene culture coevolution. And more precisely, this talk explores an original way to think about gene culture coevolution that is grounded on a specific vision of culture and cultural transmission. So the talk is organized as follows. First, I will talk about the concept of culture, cultural transmission, and cultural evolution in the context of philosophy of biology. Then I will remind us that the concept of gene culture coevolution can have different meanings. In the third time, I will introduce a new perspective of culture and cultural transmission, and I will show in the last time how this new perspective introduces a new way to think, or a different way to think about gene culture coevolution. So let's start with a few considerations about culture. So I opened the French dictionary. So in the French dictionary, culture refers to a set of material and ideological phenomena that characterizes an ethnic group or nation, a civilization, and for authors who was interested in culture and cultural transmission in the context of biology and philosophy of biology. So for them, culture is information that is capable of affecting an individual behavior and that is acquired from other members of the species by teaching, imitation, and other forms of social transmission. So cultural items jumps from one brain to another. Culture is also described as a shared ideational phenomenon, as a set of shared ideational phenomena, ideas, beliefs, value, knowledge that are learned and socially transmitted between individuals. So one question is whether there is culture in non-human species. So some authors say that there's no culture in non-human species because there is no cultural, so no accumulation of cultural knowledge. But some authors that have a specific concept of culture, like Jabonka and Nord, assert that there is culture in a non-human species. To them, culture is a system of socially transmitted patterns of behavior, preferences, and product of animal activities that characterize a group of social animals. So to sum up, we can say that culture appears as a phenomenon involving social transmission, this is important, involving mental representations, so it's an ideational phenomenon, and it characterizes social animals, human and non-human, so I add non-human, even if it's a controversial statement. So it characterizes social animals that are able to copy other behaviors through or other beliefs or other preferences through the copy of mental representations. Now let's move to the concept of cultural transmission. So cultural transmission refers to the fact that inherited information can be encoded or stored in genes or in culture, like in brains, for example, or other storage devices. So in Dawkins' terminology, cultural items are called MEM, and MEMs are units of cultural transmission. They jump from one brain to another by mutation. But more generally, as I said earlier, cultural transmission is said to be achieved through social interactions, imitation, learning. It can be transmitted in various ways. It can be transmitted vertically, so toward genetically related individuals, but also horizontally, so toward non-genetically oriented individuals. Oblique transmission is when it's transmitted toward non-genetically related individuals, but that belongs to the next generation. And cultural transmission is qualified as a Lamarckian transmission. It's very contagious, rapid, because it can be transmitted horizontally, it can spread very quickly in the population. Now, cultural evolution. So there are different ways to think about cultural evolution. One way is to do like Gaëlle Pontarotti, Feldman, Boyd, Richardson, etc. So this first way consists in thinking about cultural change in using the conceptual and methodological tools of population genetics. So in this context, there is an analogy between genetic and cultural change through time. So the change is explained by differential replication of genes or of cultural items. So cultural and genetic evolution are two different dynamics. In this evolutionary process, fitness is attributed to cultural items themselves. So they can be fit by themselves, but they can be associated with a maladaptive behavior for an organism, or that can be maladaptive for genes. So this is basically the idea of Dawkins, for example, when he makes an analogy between two kinds of evolution of selfish replicators, genes and means. So the units of cultural transmission. So these replicators are entities that show stability, fidelity, entropy, and immunity, and that support a cumulative evolutionary process driven by natural selection. But there is another way to think about cultural evolution. So in this second way, the evolution of cultural phenotypes, like social behaviors, is determined by genetic evolution. So this is the idea defended by people belonging to the research program of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. So in this context, in this kind of cultural evolution, so fitness is attributed to cultural phenotypes that are determined directly by genes. So fit cultural phenotypes are beneficial for genes. So we have been talking about gene genetic evolution, cultural evolution, but gene and cultural evolution can sometimes interact. There can be some interaction between genetic and cultural evolution. So this concept of gene cultural evolution can have different meanings. I have listed a few of them here, but I will only talk about the two I have underlined in the green. So in the first example, in the first case, gene culture coevolution refers to the fact that genetic evolution constrains cultural change. And in the second case, gene culture coevolution refers to the fact that cultural change appears as an additional source of selection pressure for genes. So the first case, in which gene culture coevolution refers to the fact that genetic evolution constrains cultural change, echoes what I've just said about sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. So in this context, social behaviors are phenotypes designed by natural selection that has been acting on genes in a given environment. So as I said, people working in sociobiology adopt this or defend this thesis. So the basic idea, to sum up and to quote a very famous quotation by Wilson, the idea is that genes hold culture on niche. More recently, the program of evolutionary psychology rests on the same idea. So for the authors that are involved in this program, in this research program, mind is a set of information processing machines that were designed by natural selection to solve adaptive problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So minds are designed to generate the appropriate behavior. And among these behaviors that are designed by natural selection and that can be seen as cultural phenotypes, we can think about altruistic behaviors. In the second kind of gene culture coevolution, so cultural change is seen or conceived as an additional source of selection pressure for genes. So in this context, culture participates in the construction of niche, so in the process of niche construction. And as you know, in the process of niche construction, organisms modify their environment, and in doing so, they modify the selection pressure acting on springs. So here I have mentioned an example of trait, so sickle cell anemia, which can be explained by gene culture coevolution with this specific meaning. So how can you explain the evolution of sickle cell anemia? So where you have a red blood cell that has this normal shape, and some of them have this sickle shape. So in this case, cultural tradition, like land farming, we are talking about modify the landscape of the population. This modification favors the apparition of stagnant water. The stagnant water favors the presence of mosquitoes that bring malaria, and so the presence of mosquitoes bringing malaria represents a new selection pressure on genes. So it green, it leads to the selection of sickle cell phenotypes that are linked to a specific genotype. So this is an example of gene culture coevolution. But now I would like to explore a new understanding, a new view, a new vision of gene culture coevolution that is, as I said earlier, grounded on a new or different vision of culture and of cultural transmission. So in this context, culture appears as a set. So the first part was quite descriptive. This part is more exploratory, so it's a work in progress. But because I'm with philosophers, I dare. Okay, so in this context, culture appears as a set of cultural traits, behaviors, beliefs, techniques, etc., that determine a biological system's access to its environment, basically like any other traits. So these cultural traits are not considered per se, but they are considered as part of composite biological systems. I'm going to explain all this in the next slide. Cultural transmission appears as a reconstruction through a specific channel, social interaction, of cultural traits of composite biological systems, and the gene culture coevolution refers here to the coevolution of genetic and cultural traits in composite biological systems. And actually, this vision is grounded on an inclusive and organizational perspective of biological inheritance, in which cultural transmission is part of a more general phenomenon involving the reconstruction of a complex network of heterogeneous traits, cultural traits, genetic traits. I'm going to explain all this in the next slide. So, what is an organizational perspective of biological inheritance that allows me to think again about cultural transmission and gene culture coevolution? So, let's go back to the idea of inheritance. So, inheritance refers to the transgenerational reconstruction of variation in traits through organic reproduction. In gene-centric accounts or models that were used during the 20th century, and that are mostly used today also, inheritance is the transgenerational reconstruction of traits through the duplication of genes. For a few years now, many authors say that inheritance cannot anymore be just a matter of genes, that the phenomenon inheritance involves more than the transmission of genes. So they describe inheritance, grosso modo, as the transgenerational reconstruction of traits through the reconstruction of genes, epigenetic marks, and many other elements, among which elements of the environment. So I suggest you to go and read all these authors because, of course, I don't have time to do that. And as for myself, I have developed a middle ground approach, an organizational perspective, in which inheritance appears as the transgenerational reconstruction of organizational patterns through the reconstruction of heterogeneous inherited elements, genetic and non-genetic, in a given environment. So in this perspective, inheritance involves more than genes, but it doesn't include environments. So this concept of inheritance, this organizational perspective, fully takes into account the fact that biological systems are traditionally thought of as organized beings. So organization is a trademark, sorry for the first biological, but organization is a trademark of biological systems. So since the end of the 18th century, maybe earlier, Victor will say, but since the seminal work of Kant and then the first works of the 19th century and the birth of biology as a full discipline, so biological systems are organized systems, so they are entities in which parts are understood with respect to the whole. This is the concept of organization, at least in Kant's contribution. And they are entities in which parts are causes and effects of themselves. So this is self-organization. So this idea has been developed in the 19th and 20th century. It's been adapted to a thermodynamically framework And for example, Fr Mex writes that biological systems are open systems that exchange matter and energy with their environment to regenerate their components. So in this perspective, they are organized systems that use environmental resources to maintain themselves and their lives. So an organizational perspective of inheritance fully takes into account the fact that biological systems can be defined, I propose this very summarizing definition, can be defined as networks of interacting parts that collectively channel flows of matter and energy to achieve self-maintenance and reproduction in a given environment. So, an organizational account of inheritance also reminds that originally, if you go back to Darwin, and you know that Darwin was one of the most important scientists involved in the conceptualization work about inheritance in the 19th century. So for Darwin, in the original species, so the entities that transmit, say, trait to offspring are described as organized beings. So I argue that initially, inheritance referred to the reconstruction of parts of a biological organization, even if this organizational background has been overlooked clearly by a trait-centered Mendelian genetics, who was interested in the transmission of traits. And not, of course, traits are not atomized, but it was this organizational background was, I think, in the theoretical background. So, to build my organizational account, I start from the idea that inheritance is initially the reconstruction of parts of an organization to build the idea that inheritance is the reconstruction of heterogeneous parts of composite organization. So let's go a little bit more into the details. So this could be a traditional genetic vision of inheritance. In this perspective, we have an homogeneous biological system that is traditionally conceived as an autonomous cell or a group of coordinated cells with the same genome, and this system transmits traits to offspring. This is idealized because even in the very simple representations, we know that, for example, multicellular organisms, they have mitochondria or blasts. So, but let's be very simple for now. So this system, this homogeneous system, includes functional and correlated parts whose presence is correlated with that of genes in a given environment. Of course, nothing can happen without environment. This is a truth. And these parts, whose presence is linked to that of genes in a given environment, collectively channel environmental resources to achieve self-maintenance and reproduction. And in this context that I have illustrated here, inheritance appears as the transgenerational reconstruction of variation in functional parts through the reconstruction of genes. So there is only one way here in a given environment. Now, in my organizational inclusive vision of inheritance, the system that transmits traits to offspring is a composite biological system that I have represented here. This system includes some parts whose presence is correlated to the presence of genes in a given environment, but also it includes parts whose presence is related to the presence of non-genetic elements in a given environment. For example, microorganisms or socially transmitted representations. So I will call the genetic part intrinsic part and the non-genetic part outsourced part. Just to make a distinction and to take into account the importance of outsourced part that could be outlooked in a more rapid approach. So these intrinsic and outsourced parts, just as in the first case, collectively channel environmental resources to achieve self-maintenance and reproduction. And so here you have the system that channels resources, so it takes resources and it gives waste in the environment, it drops waste. So he has multifarious parts who's present in a given environment is correlated with the presence of some genes, but also with the presence, for example, of some mental representations that will make them behave in a specific way. But the parts can also be related to the presence of microorganisms. So, to have the reconstruction of parts of this composite system across generation, you will need to have the reconstruction of all the elements that are correlated with these parts. So inheritance, in this context, appears as the transgenerational reconstruction of variation in intrinsic and outsourced functional parts through the reconstruction of genetic and non-genetic elements in a given environment. So, to be even more clear, I will just give an example of an outsourced part, and I will show that it can be performed by many different things, like cultural behavior, socially transmitted behavior, and some other things that I will talk about later. So I would like to focus on the example of the outsourced food processing. So food processing or food channeling refers to the function that determines biological systems access to food, to nutrients. So food processing in a given environment can be performed by intrinsic parts. For example, the enzyme you can metabolize because you have some genes and you are in a given environment will allow you to, for example, to degrade some cellulose, or will allow you to use nutrients to remake your own components. So food processing can be performed by intrinsic parts, but it can also be performed by socially transmitted behavior. For example, here, blue-tits, they learn what they should eat through social interactions. So in this paper called The Learning the Ecological Niche, the authors describe how the kind of food that the tits have access to is determined by what they learn from their parents. So here, food access is determined by what I call a cultural trait, that is a behavior whose presence is linked to the reconstruction of a mental representation through social interaction. Here, there is the example of the black rats of Jerusalem. So black rats learn how to reach some seeds in pine cones because they learn from their parents how to strip, so how to have access to this kind of food. So if there is a reconstruction of food processing patterns across generation, in this example, it's because there is a reconstruction of genes in a given environment, but also of socially transmitted behaviors. And this element together explains the reconstruction of food processing patterns. I have insisted on the example of cultural traits, but food processing can be achieved also or performed by microorganisms. I don't have time to talk about everything, but here, for example, it's very famous that, termites rely on fungi to break cellulosis. So if termites can have access to plants, some plants across generations, it's because they reconstruct their own genes, so the nuclear genes, but also because because the fungi are reconstructed across generation. So here again, the food processing function in a given environment is performed by intrinsic parts, but also by microorganisms that are outsourced parts, and the transgenerational reconstruction of food processing patterns depend on the reconstruction of intrinsic and outsourced functions through the reconstruction of genes and microorganisms or microorganisms genes in a given environment. So there are many examples of outsourced functions in the case of microbiology, and the word outsourced function is used very often in this field. So actually, I'm not inventing anything. I'm just generalizing the idea of outsourced function. So, 3 minutes. Okay. Okay. Donc, to sum up, now that we have an idea about what is an organizational vision of inheritance, we can understand how, so we can have a new understanding of gene culture coevolution. So here, culture is a set of functional parts or traits. These traits are integrated in composite biological systems, and they perform some function that I have qualified as outsourced function. And they are transmitted through social integration. So in this context, genetic and cultural traits cooperate or interact in the composite biological systems, which means that they can be thought as involved in the same evolutionary process. So gene cultural coevolution appears as a coevolution of genetic and cultural traits in a composite biological system. So basically, I just apply the idea that traits are not atomized in biological systems, they co-evolve. So this is the famous idea by Gould and Montin. So because genetic traits co-evolve, just as genetic traits co-evolve, so I'm not a genocentrist. I know that the development of traits is a very complicated process. I'm just talking about relations between the presence of genes and some traits in a given environment. So genetic traits and cultural traits co-evolve in biological systems where functional work can be achieved by multifamilious parts or heterogeneous parts whose reconstruction across generation is achieved through specific channels. So gene duplication is not enough to make account of the reconstruction of these parts. Just to finish, I have 2 minutes. So now, how can we understand the long-term coevolution of gene culture, genetic and cultural traits? Well, because if we think about the acquisition of a new cultural trait as a modification of the full organization, we can understand under what circumstances the outsourcing of the function becomes more and more important, and at some point maybe irreversible. We can understand to what extent, for example, genetic part becomes dependent on the outsourced part to be maintained themselves across generation. Just one example. Imagine that you acquire the technique to manufacture and to wear clothes. So you can interpret this as an outsourcing of part of the thermoregulation function. And it reduces the cost of thermoregulation. So you can imagine under what conditions such outsourcing will become, under what conditions, the system will become dependent on this outsourced function. For example, if there is a mutation in the system that induces the loss of the genetic capacity of doing thermoregulation, the system will be dependent on the outsourced function to do thermoregulation. If the system moves and if the temperature drops, then the system will be dependent on the outsourced function to be maintained across generation. So because this outsourced function will become more and more important. If it's not indispensable, the system will do better with the outsourced function. And also, if there is a very costly mutation in the system that was okay because the cost of regulation was less important, well, maybe the outsourcing after that is stabilized. Okay, so in this way we can make sense of the gradual stabilization of composite biological systems in which functional work can be performed by various parts. And we can think that these composite systems, functional systems, can be targeted by natural selection, like in Turner. We can think about the physiological selection to borrow a concept by Turner. And it goes with the idea, it's consistent with the idea that natural selection targets effects, so a global performance of a group of traits, and it does not necessarily target genes. So people say that non-genetic inheritance is not long-lasting and have no effect by evolution. So this organizational perspective allows to think a way in which culture or other non-genetic traits could have long-term effects on evolutionary trajectories. Thank you very much, and I hope I was not too long.